I begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner, the Creator of the heavens and the earth, and I ask Him to send peace and blessings upon all of His prophets and messengers, upon all of us, our families, our loved ones. I want to join with Bassam in condemning the heinous act of violence against your Marines here on 7/16. And in the same token, I would like to also condemn the acts of violence committed by Muslims around the world, whether by ISIS or by anyone else. From my understanding of the Quran and of the Islamic religion, these acts of violence do not fit within my faith. They are contrary to the Quran, and we should have no hesitation in condemning those acts. Hopefully, by the end of my presentation, you will see why I can feel so confident in issuing such a condemnation while at the same time believing in the Quran as the Word of God. Mike, are you hearing some kind of a buzz? Is it too loud? Okay, maybe that. How about that? I'll try that. Okay. So my good friend Mike Lacona here is in the audience with us, so I can count on his help in case I misremember something. Okay. So to continue then, let me thank David for giving me the opportunity to share this platform with him, and Dave for chairing the event for us, John, Brandon, and Ben, all of the people who are working in the background here and making it possible for me to be here with you. Now let me get right into the topic then. Is the Quran a book of peace? Now, when we address a topic like this, it's good to have criteria. How do we know, the difference between fish and rotten egg? Well, there has to be some criteria. Not only that it does how it does it smell, but does it have gills, for example? We know that one is a fish and the other is not. So, how do we know if a book is a book of peace? I don't know of any standard criteria, but we might go by some criteria which we can develop as we proceed. But it's good to have a standard criteria developed tonight, which we will use tomorrow night as well, so that we evaluate both the Bible and the Quran based on the same criteria. Now, I would suggest that one criterion is how does the book present its heroes and great figures of the past. Nowadays, of course, we're reeling from the news of shooting at a school in Oregon, and the statistics are put before us in the news about how often something like this happens, and we wonder what influences our young people. And one of the things that may influence them is the kind of heroes that they look up to, the movie stars, and we know about the violence in movies and video games and so on. We don't know all of the reasons for that, but let's think about this as one of the issues. How does a person receive his or her influence? In the case of looking at the Quran, this is even more important for Quranic studies, because academic scholars looking at the Quran have tried to look at from a naturalistic point of view, forgetting that the Quran is the Word of God, as Muslims believing it to be, just taking it as some piece of literature that developed in history. Historians want to know what were the previous influences. So what they do is they look at the Quranic text and they see that the Quran repeats many of the biblical stories, but the Quran doesn't give you the entire story. The Quran basically takes a biblical figure and then gives a new slant on the story to bring out its own moral lesson. The Quran wants to teach something. For example, the Quran wants to teach the belief that there is only one God. So the Quran takes the biblical figures and has them all preaching the same message. There is only one God. Follow this one God. I am just a prophet and a messenger of God. We don't find this exact speech of the prophets in the Bible, but we find them in the Quran. So historians say that the Quran's author, whom they will presume to be the Prophet Muhammad, and whom Muslims believe to be the Almighty God revealing this to Muhammad, the historians will say that this human author, Muhammad, obviously took the stories that he heard around him, but he refashioned the stories to bring out the particular lessons that he wanted to convey. Now that's an interesting conclusion, because when we take that conclusion and we look at the way in which the biblical figures are presented in the Quran, we will see that they are presented as peaceful individuals, or if some violence is known about them previously, that violence is considerably toned down in the Quran. And in fact, some violent individuals are just not simply mentioned at all. So if you think about people who are not mentioned at all, a good example will be Samson. He's not mentioned in the Quran. And if you think of people whose violence is considerably toned down, we will have, for example, David and Saul. They're mentioned in the Quran, but not as violent as they appear. And I will later on show in what way we can perceive or understand the violence that is actually reported about them in the Quran. But in a nutshell, I would say that the most heinous acts known from previously are not reported in the Quran. So the Quran's readers can look towards these persons as heroes and great figures of the past and not be negatively influenced by atrocities. In yesterday's papers, was it yesterday's? David Wood, my friend, made reference to Joshua's acts of genocide. Well, Joshua is not mentioned by name in the Quran, but commentators see an allusion to him in the 18th chapter of the Quran where the story of Moses is told, and Moses travels with a young companion. So commentators of the Quran say that this must be Joshua, but he's not named. In any case, this story has nothing to do with violence, and those who practice a very high level of spirituality in Islam, known as Sufis, they are attracted to this particular story of Moses and his traveling companion. And of course, the Sufis, as you probably know, are entirely non-violent. So we have again and again examples. Jesus, in whom be peace, some violence is known about him in the New Testament, but none of that in the Quran. In fact, in the Quran, he says, وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيَّ يَوْمَ وَلِدْتُ وَيَوْمَ أُمُوتُ وَيَوْمَ أُبْعَثُ حَيًّا. Peace be upon me the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I will be raised alive. So something about peace is connected with the life of Jesus in the Quranic presentation of him. The Quran insists that the message given to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the millah of Ibrahim, the religion of Abraham. And some violence is known about Abraham in the book of Genesis, where he rescues his nephew Lot from captivity. And of course, one would say that's legitimate violence, and Muslims will agree. But that violence is not mentioned about Abraham in the Quranic presentation of him. So again and again, the violence is being toned down or removed altogether, as we see in the Quran. So I think that's a very important part of the Quranic presentation, and that if you want to know what the author of the Quran is trying to convey, it is really a non-violent message. And this is a sound academic principle in understanding the Quran and its message. Now, so that's my first criterion then. How does the book present its heroes and models? Role models. Second criterion, does the book actually insist on peace? Does it give you some instruction and command for peace? And I'm sure that both books will pass this test easily. And of course, many people may be wondering, does the Quran really pass that test? And yes. In the second chapter of the Quran, in the 208th verse, it says so by explicit command, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu udkhulu fis-silmi kafa. O you who believe, enter into peace completely. The Arabic word there is silm, and some translators have rendered it enter into Islam completely. But the word in Arabic there is not Islam, it is silm, which is close to Islam, but it's not exactly the same word. They both come from the same root, from salam, which means peace. And the word silm means, as one of the great grammarians of the Quran, as Zajjaj said in his commentary, it's referred, this word is used 6 times in the Quran altogether, and in each of the 6 times it refers to musalaha, or reaching a peaceful agreement or settlement or covenant of peace. So the Quran is telling Muslims, according to this verse, you should enter into peace completely. So that's my second criterion. The third criterion, I would say, is, does the book give you a set of precepts that will ensure the longevity and establishment of peace in a society? Does it give you laws and regulations? As we have now in many of the great countries of the modern world, there has to be a legal system. Without a legal system, everybody claims the right of somebody else. In the book of Judges, it says, reporting on all of the kinds of violence that were committed in the days of old, in those days, there was no king in the land, so every man did what was right in his own eyes. So Are we going to leave it for every man to do what is right in his own eyes, or are we going to have some temporal leader with a set of rules to govern society in a complete system? Of course, sometimes it's to the embarrassment of Muslims nowadays that some people are trying to implement what they think to be that entire system. But when this system actually did work in the past, it was a comprehensive system governing all areas of life. The difficulty has been that over time, Muslim scholars tended to be traditional, tended to report what was said before by previous scholars, and whereas all of the details were worked out in societies in the past where all of these details fit very nicely, nowadays the details don't fit in our modern society, and we are all reeling from the fact that some people want to re-implement some of the precepts of old. But when we go back to what the Quran actually says, we see that the Quran gives you just the broad outlines, and it's important for us to make a distinction tonight. Our debate is about the Quran. It's not about other aspects of Islamic thinking. But for my topic here tonight, and for this criterion, my third criterion, the Quran gives you an overview of the kinds of things that are necessary for the society to run properly. You must have laws governing economics, governing politics, governing social behavior, governing family relations, and so on. So all of this is touched upon in the Quran. It's not only an exhortation to live in peace, but the Quran actually shows you how to live in peace and gives you a set of regulations so that everyone's rights are protected and people can actually live in peace. So tomorrow night our topic will be about the Bible, and naturally I'll be asking the same question about the Bible. Do we have a comprehensive system in the Bible, or would the governing of peace be left to people who are neither Muslims nor Christians, or they're not believers in God to begin with, and we expect them to enforce what we would agree to be peace? So my fourth criterion is, in the case that war becomes necessary, and we know that wars have been the feature of life from time immemorial, are we going to get rid of war just by snapping our fingers, or is war something here to stay? How do we deal with war? If war should become necessary, does the book subscribe to what we would know today to be the principles of just war? I'd like to just go to my presentation to illustrate this topic a little bit more. Now, I have here a book entitled When God Says War is Right by Darrell Cole. The subtitle, I don't know if you can read it, it says The Christian's Perspective on When and How to Fight. So this is written from a Christian point of view, but Darrell Cole is going back into Christian history and showing how the theory of just war developed over time, starting with St. Ambrose, then going to St. Augustine, and then St. Thomas Aquinas. So we have Ambrose, Augustine, and Aquinas. It looks like that's 3 A's, right? And then that work was capped off by Calvin. So now we have 3 A's and a C. Is a good report card to have, right? Okay. So Darrell Cole traces the thinking of these great scholars of Christianity and shows the kinds of principles that they arrived at over time. First, there are principles that to be observed before you go into war. What justifies you going into war? He said that there are 5 principles. 1, that war can only be fought by a proper authority. 2, for a just cause. 3, with the right intention. 4, I'm going to forget the 4th one here, Brother Bassam. So who remembers the 4th one? The 4th principle of just war. That as a last resort. I rename it now because Darrell Cole actually puts it as when the war is the only way of righting the wrong. He doesn't like the term last resort because he thinks somebody can always argue that that's not the last resort. You didn't try everything yet. But I'll call it last resort just because this is simple and this is what most people can easily relate to. And it's the same thing, because even if you say that that's the only way of righting the wrong, somebody can always argue with you that something else was a solution and you didn't try that yet. So last resort works anyway. And then to continue with Darrell Cole, the last point is that the war, when it is done with all of these, by the legitimate authority, by for the just cause and with the right intention, and as a last resort, then it must be. And I forget, Bassam, you remember this last point. I'll tell you what's. Without excessive force? No, I will come to the excessive force. Say again? Sustainable? I will tell you in a moment, if I can get my notes on that.
You can pause the time.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'll continue. I will come back to that point. I will tell you. Okay. So those are principles before going into war. And then within the war itself, how do you govern yourself? There are two principles. One is proportionality, and the other is discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. Proportionality, obviously, you cannot go fighting more than is necessary. You don't bomb more than is necessary, and so on. You calculate the pros and cons and the benefits and harms of the actions that you are engaging it within war. And discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, this is essential. And of course, this is one of the principles that are often being violated by Muslim terrorists. They think that they're serving the religious cause, but of course they're not practicing this particular principle. Now, I would say that all of these principles are actually observed in the Quran. And I would ask David, I know that David will want to bring up this verse or that verse of the Quran. I would ask him to see if that verse can actually fit within these just war principles. And if these verses cannot fit within the just war principles, then of course we'd like to know what they are and then think about what we need to do about these verses that are there in the Quran. But in my reading of the Quran, I find that the Quran actually is for a just war. It allows for the just war, and these are the principles that it gives us over time. Now, as we come to this, I need to go one step further and say that this idea of the just war theory has developed further in modern times. And we have here Professor Andrew Wilson, and he has put together one of the great courses from the teaching company, putting university courses into accessible format for ordinary folks like you and me. And his book and course is with the title Masters of War. He gives us the further principle that there is something to be observed as you bring the war to an end. Bringing the war to an end also requires certain principles. There should be repatriation. The war should come to a nice close so that at the end you realize that you have achieved what you started out to achieve. If there was an oppressor to be removed, you've actually removed the oppressor. If there was a harm, you've actually removed the harm. Whatever was the objective of the war is actually now achieved. And if the repatriation needs to be given, that is given. If somebody needs to be brought to trial, that person is brought to trial, and so on. And so we have justice in going into a war, justice during the war, and justice at the end of the war. So the one principle which I had forgotten previously, and it now pops into my mind, is that the war itself, it should not be. I thought I had it a moment ago, but I'll come back to you. Okay. I'll come back to you. So we said 5 principles of just war before going into the war, 2 principles within the war itself, and some principles which are still loosely defined because scholars are still working on this, what is to be done at the end of the war to bring the war to a nice and round finish. Now, when we look at the Quran today, we must distinguish between what the Quran actually says and what people may say about it afterwards. And one of the things that were said afterwards are things that actually evolved in Muslim communities. People attributed things back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, things that he may or may not have said, just like people have attributed things to Jesus, and people have written apocryphal Gospels, for example. Now, I have with me here a book entitled War and Peace in the World's Religions by Perry Schmidt-Leukel. It contains many articles by great scholars, including one by Lloyd Ridgeon on Islam's view of war and peace. And Lloyd Ridgeon points out that the documents that were circulated by Muslims in the early centuries of Islam, and biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are not necessarily reliable, especially when it comes to matters of war and peace, because the Islamic Empire was in an expansionary phase, and that's how the scholars and thinkers at the time saw themselves. They saw that they were expanding, and they read that expansion back into the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as if he said all of these things, and if he directed this expansion himself. But these are later developments. We cannot be anachronistic and read this back into the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now, those biographies are comprised of little bits of information. Just like you go to the Gospel according to Mark, you see that Jesus went here and then he went there. These are 2 little episodes. So these episodes in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, compiled in the biographies, are also compiled separately in other books known as hadith books. They're massive books, compiling many little episodes. Some of those episodes are reliable, some are not reliable. And even though some Muslim scholars in history have classified certain books to be the most reliable books, that does not mean that they themselves considered each and every one of the reports to be absolutely reliable. To this day, we have scholars who are very traditional, who want to follow the way of life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as it was, and yet they regard some of these individual sayings to be not reliable. So, as a general principle, we would say, with Shah Waliullah of Delhi, that the first stop is the Quran. If something is clearly settled in the Quran, you don't get the contrary from some other source. So that's our investigation tonight. What does the Quran actually say about peace? And I would say that the Quran actually does answer that it is a book of peace, and this is how I would like to end. And I would not accept a contrary answer from another source. Thank you all very much.
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga for hosting our debate tonight. There are many places in the world where an exchange like this would be impossible, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to have open, honest discussions even here in the United States. So I'm glad that the First Amendment is still alive and well in Chattanooga. I'd also like to thank my friend Shabir for coming all the way from Canada to address the concerns of a community so recently ravaged by terrorism. I met Shabir in 2004 when he came to Virginia to debate Mike Licona. Hi, Mike. I took Shabir to see The Passion of the Christ that afternoon, and later we headed to the debate. I sat in the audience that night with my best friend, Nabil Qureshi. Nabil and I started hanging out together a few years earlier when our classmates would go out doing things that we had no interest in doing, leaving us to sit around and talk. Christians and Muslims share many of the same values, and it was my shared values with Nabil that led to our friendship. But the most important value we shared was that we both wanted to go wherever the evidence pointed, even if it hurt. So we didn't shy away from difficult topics. We talked about Jesus. We talked about Muhammad. We talked about the Bible. We talked about the Quran. And our arguments got much more heated than anything you're going to see here tonight. But even in the course of our arguments, we always understood that we didn't hate one another. When we were criticizing one another, we didn't assume that this meant that because we argue a lot, we must therefore hate one another. We always understood that we had each other's best interest in mind. And we were determined to get to the truth, and we did. I highly recommend my friend Nabil's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. My point here is that criticism and hatred are not the same thing. When Shabir and I say something critical of something you happen to believe tonight or tomorrow, it's not because we hate you. It's because we respect you enough to be honest and straightforward about our disagreements. But I find myself in a difficult position tonight because tomorrow night we'll be debating whether the Bible is a book of peace. I'm assuming that if I'm really nice to Shabir tonight, he's probably going to be really nice to me tomorrow night, but if I take a more aggressive approach, he's probably going to return the favor tomorrow. So, what's a Christian to do when he looks in front of him and sees the best Muslim debater in the world staring back at him? It's at times like this I recall the advice my dad used to give me. He'd say, son, you're going to walk on thin ice. You might as well dance. With this Wood family wisdom in mind, I say to my friend Shabir, let's dance. Now, Shabir has given us one version of what Islam teaches, but he and I must be reading the Quran very, very differently. And it's not just the two of us who are reading it differently. Shabir's obviously reading the Quran differently from the way it was read by, ISIS or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And as I'll show in this debate, he's also reading the Quran differently from the way it was read by Muhammad and his companions. So let me explain how I interpret the Quran, and in our rebuttals we can respond to each other and see who's more in line with Orthodox Islam. I'll start at the beginning. The word Islam means submission. In its religious context, it refers to submission to Allah. But Islam doesn't just tell you that you must submit to Allah. It tells you how you must submit to Allah. You submit to Allah by unquestioningly obeying the commands of Allah and Muhammad. Chapter 33, verse 36 of the Quran. It is not fitting for a believer, man or woman, when a matter has been decided by Allah and His Messenger, to have any option about their decision. If anyone disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he is indeed on a clearly wrong path. When a matter has been decided by Allah and Muhammad, believers have no option but obedience. Chapter 4, verse 65. But know, by your Lord, they can have no faith until they make you, Muhammad, judge in all disputes between them, and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions, and accept them with full submission. Muslims can have no real faith until they make Muhammad their judge in all disputes, and have no resistance against Muhammad's decisions. Fortunately, understanding what Allah commands shouldn't be very difficult, because Allah claims that His commands are perfectly clear. Chapter 11, verse 1 of the Quran. This is a book whose verses have been made firm and free from imperfection, and then they have been expounded in detail. 12:1. These are verses of the clear book. 15:1. These are the verses of the book and of a Quran that makes things clear. 24:46. Certainly we have revealed clear communications. 26:2. These are the verses of the book that makes things clear. 27:1. These are verses of the Quran, a book that makes things clear. 28:2. These are verses of the book that makes things clear. 57:9. He it is who sends down clear communications upon His servant, that He may bring you forth from utter darkness into light. Allah, according to the Quran, means exactly what He says. But there's a problem, because we go to the Quran and we find verses that seem to be saying different things. Surah 8, verse 61. But if they incline to peace, your enemies, but if they incline to peace, you also incline to it, and put your trust in Allah. This sounds like peace is the goal. Then we read chapter 47, verse 35. Be not weary and faint-hearted, crying for peace, when you should be uppermost. Here, dominating unbelievers seems to be the goal, and Muslims aren't to seek peace when they are supposed to be uppermost. Now, if Allah's commands are perfectly clear, why do they change from one revelation to the next? The polytheists of Mecca asked this very question, and Allah clarified the matter in Surah 2, verse 106. Whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. Do you not know that Allah has power over all things? This verse explains the Islamic doctrine of abrogation. Allah abrogates or cancels certain verses by revealing new verses. So Islam actually has a very simple method of Quran interpretation. When you see two verses that are in conflict, the only question you need to ask usually is which one came later. With this framework in mind, we're now in a position to understand all of the conflicting verses on peace and violence in the Quran by considering how these verses unfolded during the life of Muhammad. And here we find that jihad proceeds in stages, according to the status of Muslims in a society. Let's go through the three stages of jihad. Stage 1. When Muhammad and his followers were only a tiny minority of the population, they were commanded to preach a message of peace and tolerance. If a Muslim had a disagreement with a polytheist, he was simply to say, to you be your religion, and to me be my religion. At this stage, Muslims weren't allowed to fight, even in self-defense, even to protect themselves against persecution. What's interesting, however, is that even though Muhammad was outwardly preaching a message of peace and tolerance, behind closed doors, he was already plotting to conquer Arabia and other lands. One day, some of Muhammad's tribesmen went to his uncle, Abu Talib, because they wanted to arrange a truce with Muhammad. They wanted Muhammad to stop criticizing their beliefs and their gods. Watch how Muhammad responds in the history of At-Tabari. Abu Talib sent for the messenger of Allah. And when he came in, he said, Nephew, here are the sheikhs and nobles of your tribe. They have asked for justice against you, that you should desist from reviling their gods, and they will leave you to your God. Uncle, he said, shall I not summon them to something which is better for them than their gods? What do you summon them to, he asked. He replied, I summon them to utter a saying, through which the Arabs will submit to them, and they will rule over the non-Arabs. Abu Jahl said from among the gathering, what is it, by your father? We will give you it and 10 like it. He, Muhammad, answered that you should say there is no God but Allah. Muhammad tells his tribe, become Muslims and will rule over the Arabs and the non-Arabs. We can use the Shahada, there is no God but Allah, to make people submit. Why is Muhammad walking around Mecca preaching a message of peace and tolerance, but behind closed doors he's plotting to conquer? Allah later clears this up in chapter 3, verse 28 of the Quran. Let not the believers take disbelievers for their friends in preference to believers. Whoso doeth that hath no connection with Allah, unless it be that you but guard yourselves against them, taking as it were security. Don't be friends with non-Muslims unless it's to guard yourselves against them. Ibn Kathir, the most respected Muslim commentator of all time, explains the meaning of this verse as follows. Unless you indeed fear a danger from them, meaning except those believers who in some areas or times fear for their safety from the disbelievers. In this case, such believers are allowed to show friendship to the disbelievers outwardly, but never inwardly. For instance, Al-Bukhari recorded that Abu ad-Darda said, we smile in the face of some people, although our hearts curse them. Al-Bukhari said that Al-Hasan said, Taqiyya is allowed until the day of resurrection. Here we have the doctrine of taqiyya, which takes different forms in different situations, but in this context refers to Muhammad and his companions pretending to be friendly towards the disbelievers in order to protect the Muslim community while Muhammad plotted to conquer and subjugate the unbelievers. Stage 2. When Muhammad had gained a larger following and had formed alliances with various tribes, but wasn't yet strong enough to subjugate the unbelievers, he was ordered to wage defensive jihad. At this stage, Muslims are allowed to fight the unbelievers, but the unbelievers have to do something first. The unbelievers have to start it. A characteristic passage is Surah 2, verses 190 to 193. And fight in the way of Allah with those who fight with you. And do not exceed the limits. Surely Allah does not love those who exceed the limits. And kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out from whence they drove you out. And persecution is severer than slaughter. And do not fight with them at the sacred mosque until they fight with you in it. But if they do fight you, then slay them, such is the recompense of the unbelievers. But if they desist, then surely Allah is forgiving, merciful. And fight with them until there is no persecution, and religion should be only for Allah. But if they desist, then there should be no hostility except against the oppressors. So there's fighting in stage 2, but the fighting is a response to persecution or oppression or even criticism. Many Muslims in the West insist that this is the end of the story. Fighting is self-defense. But the revelations continued to change as the Muslim community expanded. Stage 3. When Muhammad and his followers became the most powerful force in Arabia, they were commanded to wage offensive jihad, violently subjugating unbelievers simply for being unbelievers. Surah 9, verse 29 of the Quran commands Muslims to fight those who believe not in Allah. Notice, this doesn't say fight those who fight you. That was stage 2. This verse tells Muslims to fight people based on their beliefs. Surah 9, verse 73. O Prophet, strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites and be unyielding to them. Notice, strive hard against whom? Against oppressors? Against persecutors? No, strive hard against the unbelievers, non-Muslims, and hypocrites, people who claim to be following Muhammad but aren't really following his commands. Chapter 9, verse 23. O you who believe, fight those of the unbelievers who are near to you and let them find in you hardness. 48:29. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and those who are with him are severe against disbelievers and merciful among themselves. The distinction in these verses is not between people who are attacking you and people who aren't attacking you. The distinction here is between believers and unbelievers, and Muslims are told, only show mercy towards fellow believers. Now, the most common response to passages like this is the context defense. Surely you must be taking these verses out of context. Well, let's look at the context of one of these commands. Generally, when we're referring to the context of a Quran verse, we either mean the historical context, what was happening when the verse was revealed, or the literary context, what do the verses in the surrounding passages say. Ibn Kathir gives us the historical context. After Muhammad conquered Mecca, he eventually told the polytheists of Arabia that they could no longer take the religious pilgrimage to Mecca, which they'd been doing for centuries. Members of Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, were upset because They earned a lot of money from their dealings with the polytheists. Here's what happened. Allah Most High ordered the believers to prohibit the disbelievers from entering or coming near the sacred mosque. On that, the Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, thought that this would reduce their profits from trade. Therefore, Allah Most High compensated them and ordered them to fight the people of the book until they embrace Islam or pay the jizya. He then quotes chapter 9, verses 28 to 29. Therefore, the Messenger of Allah decided to fight the Romans in order to call them to Islam. According to the historical context, Surah 9, verse 29, fight those who believe not in Allah, was revealed because Muhammad's tribe were wondering how they were going to make money. And after receiving this revelation, Muhammad decided to fight the Romans until to invite them to Islam. If the Romans converted, they would pay zakat. If they didn't convert, they would pay jizya. Either way, through fighting them, revenue would come to the Meccans. That's the historical context. What about the literary context? We'll see if we can find something peaceful here. The passage begins in verse 28 and continues through verse 33. I'll try and squeeze it all in. We'll read the entire passage. Verse 28. O you who believe, truly the pagans are unclean. So let them not, after this year of theirs, approach the sacred mosque. And if you fear poverty, soon will Allah enrich you, if He wills, out of His bounty, for Allah is all-knowing, all-wise. How is Allah going to enrich them? Next verse. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden, which hath been forbidden by Allah and His messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth from among the people of the book, that's Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. But why fight Jews and Christians? Aren't we believers too? Next verse. And the Jews say, Ezra is the son of Allah. And the Christians say, the Messiah is the son of Allah. These are the words of their mouths. They imitate the saying of those who disbelieved before. Allah's curse be upon them, how they are turned away. So, Jews and Christians aren't real monotheists. We're unbelievers as well. Have we done anything else? Next verse. They took their rabbis and their monks to be their lords besides Allah and Christ the son of Mary. Yet they were commanded to worship but one God. There is no God but He. Praise and glory to Him, far is He from having the partners they associate with Him. Any other reason to fight us? Next verse. They desire to put out the light of Allah with their mouths. Notice it says with our mouths. This is talking about what we say, what we preach, not us attacking the Muslim community with an army. But Allah will not allow but that His light should be perfected, even though the unbelievers may detest it. Allah won't allow Jews and Christians to spread our false beliefs through preaching. But how's Allah going to stop us? Next verse. It is He who hath sent His messenger, Muhammad, with guidance and the religion of truth, Islam, to prevail it over all religion, even though the idolaters may detest it. How is Allah going to prevail? Surah 9, verse 29. Fight those who believe not in Allah till they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, that's the entire passage. Where's the part about self-defense? Where's one word about self-defense? Every criterion for fighting Jews and Christians in this passage has to do with what we believe. If Allah means to say, only fight people who are attacking you, this is a very strange way of saying it. And if He says, fight those who believe not in Allah, when He really means fight in self-defense, He most certainly is not the perfectly clear communicator He claims to be. Putting all of this together, Islam means submission. You submit to Allah by unquestioningly obeying the commands of Allah and Muhammad. Allah claims that His commands are perfectly clear. Later revelations abrogate earlier revelations, so bringing up peaceful verses doesn't work if they've been abrogated. And Muhammad couldn't hope to win a physical confrontation with the unbelievers. He promoted peace and tolerance outwardly while plotting in secret to conquer the unbelievers. When his numbers increased, he began fighting the unbelievers, but only defensively. And when he became the most powerful force in Arabia, he began subjugating the unbelievers. Now, what I find most fascinating about all of this is you can pick any country in the world and it will follow this pattern, the pattern laid down by Muhammad. In countries like the United States, where Muslims make up about 1% of the population, the message of Islam is peace and tolerance. In places of the world where Muslims make up 20, 30% of the population, so they're strong enough to fight, but not strong enough to dominate the unbelievers, the message of Islam is if you criticize us or do something, you're going to get some sort of violent reaction, defensive jihad. In places like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, where Muslims are the strongest force, unbelievers are violently oppressed or at the very least, they are second-class citizens. Now, just so no one misunderstands me here, I am only talking about what Islam teaches and how these teachings tend to surface in various ways around the world. I'm not talking about what individual Muslims believe. Muslims are as diverse as any other religious group in the world, and so when your Muslim friend tells you that Islam is a religion of peace, he or she probably believes it. But our topic tonight is not what do your Muslim friends believe. Our topic is the Quran a book of peace? And I don't see how a book that calls for the ongoing violent subjugation of unbelievers can be a book of peace.
Thank you, Dr. Wood.
So welcome back, those of you who have prayed. I hope you prayed for all of us, and I pray that God will accept your prayers on behalf of all of us. Now, for my 12-minute rebuttal, let me remind you of where I began. I said that we need to have criteria. Otherwise, it's anybody's bias. I don't like your book. I don't like your nose. Your nose is too long, too short, too flat, and too pointed, or whatever. But we need to have some criteria. How do we know if a book is a book of peace? And we need to apply the same criteria to both books. David is right. We have to dance. Well, the dance continues till tomorrow. So my 4 criteria. 1 is, how does the book present its heroes? And I've said this is important in the case of the Quran because historians of religion want to know what were the influences that shaped the Quran as a literary product. Forget that it's the word of God. And from a historical point of view, they say that Muhammad took the stories of old, from the Bible especially, and refashioned those stories to bring out the particular lessons he wanted to bring out. So my question to us now tonight is, why do those stories have these biblical figures appearing to be very peaceful? That shows that the Quran means to be a peaceful book and to influence its readers towards peace, not towards violence. Second, does the book offer a direct command? And we have seen that it actually does in Surah 2, verse 108, for example. And then, what about the legal system? This is 108, verse number 208. What about the legal system? That was my 3rd criterion. Does it just simply preach to you, okay, be peaceful, but how are you going to be peaceful in a society unless you have a polity that is going to bring people together to live in peace? To me, the Quran actually does that. The regrettable part is that Muslim scholars over the centuries have not allowed that polity to develop to address modern concerns. And Muslim believers are reeling under the pressure from laws which were framed a long time ago but do not address their real needs in present times. And non-Muslims looking at some Muslims trying to apply some arcane laws are asking, is this really your Islam? Well, if that's it, I don't want Islam. I don't want your Sharia or any law. But we recognize that any modern state has to be governed by a legal system. And the question, does the book present a legal system that will allow people to live together in peace? And my 4th criterion was about just war principles. And I'll just mention the one thing that I'd forgotten previously, that there should be a reasonable hope for success. If you're going to enter into a war, you must foresee that this is going to end up with success. Otherwise, you're going to waste the lives of your soldiers, and you're going to waste the lives of the other people, and in the end, you still have the original problem that you're dealing with, so the war becomes pointless. I wish that some Muslims and others had remembered this, like the ISIS, for example. Do they have a reasonable hope of success, or are they living under delusions of grandeur? Sometimes we wish that some modern governments had planned carefully before they enter into wars and find themselves in a quagmire. Our soldiers are there, they cannot get out, but they're dying and the body bags are coming back. So does the war do you have a reasonable hope of success before entering into the war? These are just war principles that I talked about. Principles before entering into a war, principles of conduct within the war, and principles to be observed as you bring the war to a close, to make sure that the war is not going to suddenly pop back into existence and you have the problem all over again. You have dealt with the problem effectively that you wanted to deal with in the first place. My contention was that all of the verses of the Quran will actually fall within just war principles. And that shows that the Quran still is a book of peace, even though it allows for war, but it is allowing for a just war. I don't think that in anything David said, he actually proved that any verse of the Quran actually falls outside of these principles. What I find is that David has picked some of the verses that will actually have most emotional effect, and he has tried to paint the Quran to be a very violent book without an overall historical framework within which to examine how these verses came into being as they are. So I will give you a framework. Now, from a Muslim point of view, this is the Word of God, and all of this is coming from divine wisdom. Let's put that point of view aside for the moment and look at the matter from a historical point of view. Historians, for example, William Montgomery Watt, will not say that all of these hadiths, reports about what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said and did and approved, that these are all authentic. In fact, there's been a long history in academia of saying that the hadiths are not authentic. And on the other hand, Muslims who want to preserve their traditional way of life and their belief system have been insisting, no, the hadiths are as they are. We have books collected, the hadiths are in there, they're authentic. So we have two extremes. Academia on the one hand, modern non-Muslim Orientalist scholars studying the religions of the Middle East and Eastern countries more generally. And on the other hand, the Muslims defending their faith and saying, no, it's all authentic. They're saying, no, it's not authentic. These are saying, not authentic. In between, we have some Orientalist scholars, such as Harold Motsky, and I just mentioned the name William Montgomery Watt, who take a middle position and say that some are authentic, some are not authentic. We need to have some criteria for deciding what are authentic and what are not. Now, I want to know, where does David fit within this spectrum? If he's a Muslim, he might say, and I would understand, some Muslims do say that I disagree with them, they'll say it's all authentic. So he's saying, okay, it's all authentic. That hadith says so, and the Prophet was planning this. Bukhari said so, Ibn Kathir said so, that's all authentic, our scholars are right, because he's speaking as a Muslim. If he's speaking as a non-Muslim, I expect him to either come to the middle position with some of the Orientalist scholars, or to the other extreme with some of the other Orientalist scholars and say, we don't accept any of these hadiths. Noldek, for example, said that the Quran we accept to be authentic as a record of what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said and did, but not the other later materials. So the Quran, we Muslims believe, was recorded, put into writing very soon after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But by contrast, even Muslims say the books of hadith and the seerah, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the history books, like David was quoting a book by a man named Tabari who died in the year 310 of the Muslim era, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, died in the year 11. So this other man was writing a few hundred years, at least 200 years, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So David is quoting that man's words as if those are authentic. So where does he stand? Does he stand as a Muslim saying, yeah, those are our scholars, we believe them? Or does he stand with the non-Muslim scholars, and which group? If he does not identify where he stands, it looks like he's just picking and choosing and just throwing anything for emotional effect. So too with the idea of abrogation. He's attributing this to the Quran because he can cite a verse, the second chapter of the Quran, the 106th verse. But scholars have looked at that verse and said that even though Muslim scholars have read that verse and said that this is about abrogation, this verse does not actually mean that verses of the Quran abrogate each other. Let me explain the concept. What David is saying is, look, there are verses of the Quran which seem peaceful. That looks like stage 1. There are verses which say fight in self-defense. That looks like stage 2. Then there are verses which say go and take over the enemy. That's stage 3. So how do we go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3? Did God give different instructions? The Muslim scholars, actually, some Muslim scholars will agree with him, some classical scholars. But then, is David citing them as his scholars? Whereas, on the other hand, some non-Muslim scholars, for example, John Burton, says that this is not an idea of abrogation. It's not that the verses are giving you one instruction, repealing it with a later instruction, such that one verse of the Quran cancels out another verse. He says that the Quran, speaking of abrogation in Surah 2, verse 106, the very verse that David cited, is actually speaking about the Quran abrogating previous revelations. Meaning that God has previously sent messages to previous prophets, to Moses, to David, to Jesus, and now God has finally sent a message to the Prophet Muhammad, and it is this final message which Muslims are required to follow today. So this final message repeals the others. Of course, the moral code will remain the same, the basic beliefs will remain the same, but there could be specific dispensations suitable to certain times and climes, and now God has given us his final instructions for these times, so this is what we follow. Now, if we now understand the Quran in this way, that the Quran is a document by itself, that's what our topic is. Our topic is not all of Islam and everything that Muslim scholars have said. It is, in that note, interesting that some of the final words that David said in his conclusion, I noted down. He said something close to these words. I am only talking about what Islam teaches. I'm only talking about what Islam teaches. That means it's off topic, because our topic is not what Islam teaches. Our topic is the Quran a book of peace? It is possible that the Quran teaches one thing, and Muslims may have evolved their faith to teach something else. And there could be many things called Islam. Why should we think that there's only one Islam? As if there is one person in the world named Islam, and then he speaks, and then we know what he says. There are many people following what they call a religion of Islam, and there are many different followings, many people teaching different things. So you cannot just simply with a single brush paint all of Islam in the same way. And in any case, that is not our topic. So he says when Muhammad became a powerful force, that is when he began to dominate the enemy, or there are verses in the Quran which preach dominance. But if you put that within the framework of just war principles, even if he was right, then you would see that, in fact, just war principles actually prescribe something like this, that if you are weak, that Sun Tzu said this actually, 1,000 years before the Prophet Muhammad, ancient Chinese militarist, in his book Art of War, which today is studied in business circles, and the strategies are, we didn't realize that business people are going to war with us for our money, but, they're doing this. So if you're weak, then you practice other tactics. And if you're strong, then you do something that is consonant with that strength. But that does not mean that you can do something unjust. And there's nothing in the Quran that prescribes that you can do something unjust. In fact, quite the contrary. The Quran stands for justice and tells us that all of the prophets of God were sent by God in order to institute justice. So that's the bottom line, justice. But if you have power, then you have the responsibility to protect using that power. You cannot be idle and let some people be oppressed. The Quran in the 4th chapter, in the 75th verse, actually speaks specifically about this. So when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his first followers were in the Prophet's hometown, they were weak and downtrodden. They could not respond. They were being beaten and oppressed. But when they moved away and formed a separate polity, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was accepted as the head of state in a new city, that is when he had the responsibility to protect his own citizens and also the oppressed people everywhere. So naturally, the modus operandi changes, but the original principle does not change. The original principle of justice and mercy and kindness. So we cannot then take what people have said over time. Muslim scholars have interpreted it in their own way. Now we have to look at it in an academic and unbiased fashion, and then we see that the Quran emerges as a book of peace. Thank you.
Wood?
Well, thank you, Shabir. And I think the debate so far is an excellent demonstration of the different methods of interpreting Islam. On the one hand, we have the traditional Islamic method of interpreting the Quran, and we have the new Western method of interpreting the Quran. The traditional method of interpreting the Quran is based on the idea that Allah means what he says. Allah tells you what to believe. You don't tell Allah what he actually means. The Western method of interpreting the Quran is based on going through the Quran, finding passages that somehow agree or can be interpreted to agree with Western values, and then using those to reinterpret all of the passages that call for violence or subjugation. Now, Shabir brings up his criteria. He says that the Quran presents biblical figures as peaceful figures. Well, the more peaceful the Quran presents biblical figures, the worse the contrast between them and Muhammad. Because as we've seen, Muhammad eventually called for the violent subjugation of unbelievers for being unbelievers. He asks, does the Quran have a direct command about peace and violence? Yes, the Quran has commands about peace and violence. But as I pointed out, those commands depend on the status of Muslims in a society. And the violent passages come about when Muslims are in a position to dominate unbelievers. He says, do these commands fall into a just war theory? No. Fighting unbelievers, specifically for being unbelievers, based on their beliefs as Jew or Christian, does not fall into just war theory. Shabir says that I've picked verses that have an intended, a desired emotional impact, that I'm picking out very bad verses of the Quran. Actually, I quoted peaceful and violent Quran verses to show the different roles that these verses play based on the status of Muslims in a society. So I drew attention to peaceful verses of the Quran, which apply in those kinds of situations. When I quote the violent passages, that's because those are the final marching orders of the Quran. There's nothing absurd if we're asking, whether the Quran is a book of peace to ask, what are the final marching orders? What is its final message about what people are supposed to do? And that's very important. If the Quran for 1,000 pages called for nothing but peace and tolerance, and on the last page said, by the way, fight everyone who disagrees with you, that wouldn't be a book of peace, right? Those are the final marching orders. And so when we look at the final marching orders of the Quran, and chapter 9 was the last major surah of the Quran revealed, and what do we find when we look at the last major surah of the Quran revealed? Fight those who do not believe in Allah, fight those of the unbelievers who are near to you, and let them find in you hardness. O prophet, strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites and be unyielding to them. If you want to reinterpret those, you have to say Allah is just not very clear. But Allah repeatedly says He's clear. So you have to pick one, but you can't have both Allah claiming to be clear and these verses meaning something radically different from what they're saying. Shabir says that we need criteria for distinguishing between authentic and non-authentic Muslim traditions. And if you recall what I did, almost every passage I quoted was from the Quran, wasn't it? Because that's a topic. The only time I quoted non-Quranic sources was when I quoted what the Quran says. I pointed out what it obviously means, and then I quoted Islam's most trusted commentator on the Quran to show that he agrees with my interpretation of the Quran. So I didn't just quote them and he's saying something that totally contradicts the Quran. I quoted the Quran, showed what the Quran says, and then I quoted Ibn Kathir as support. Say this, he agrees that it means exactly what I'm saying. It means, just to show that I'm not just inventing my interpretations as I go along. So I didn't quote many sources outside of the Quran. I believe I quoted Ibn Kathir twice. I don't remember if I quoted anything else. But if Shabir wants to distinguish true sources from non-authentic sources, well, Muslims have methods for doing that, right? They have hadith criticism. But when we apply the methods of hadith criticism to distinguish true sayings of Muhammad from unreliable sayings of Muhammad, this doesn't help. These criteria do not help, because you end up with passages which are deemed authentic by Muslim scholars, by hadith scholars, and you end up with passages like Muhammad saying in Sahih al-Bukhari 69:24, I've been commanded to fight people until they say La ilaha illallah. I've been commanded to fight people until they become Muslims. Now, here again, if you want to interpret that in some other way, which, by the way, lines up perfectly with what the Quran says, fight those who do not believe in Allah, what are you going to do? How do you reinterpret that? Let me put it this way. If Allah says, fight those who do not believe in Allah, when He really means fight in self-defense, and Muhammad says, I've been commanded to fight against people till they say there's no God but Allah, and He actually means fight people in self-defense, these are not very good communicators we're dealing with. These are disturbingly bad communicators. And I just have to point out that it seems like I have more respect for the clarity of Allah's statements and of Muhammad's statements than many Muslims. Another passage, Sahih al-Bukhari 2797, that is authentic by Muslim criteria of hadith. And here, don't take these as independent, just with what the Quran's, going along with what the Quran says to show that Muhammad agrees with my interpretation. Sahih al-Bukhari 2797, Muhammad says, by him in whose hand my soul is, I would love to be martyred in Allah's cause, and then come back to life, and then get martyred, and then come back to life again, and then get martyred, and then come back to life again, and then get martyred. Shabir can throw out this passage all he wants, but my point is, when Allah says that you have to unquestioningly obey Him, and then He says His commands are perfectly clear, and then He tells you, fight those who do not believe in Allah, how am I supposed to interpret that? I interpret it as, okay, if I'm in a situation, so this wouldn't apply to Muslims in the West, but if I'm in a situation where Muslims are the strongest force, then I have to violently subjugate unbelievers. And that's how Muhammad interprets it. That's how Islam's greatest interpreters of all time interpreted it. So who are we in the 21st century to say, no, that's not what Allah meant, even though He says He's perfectly clear. Muhammad, he didn't understand what Allah really meant, even though, according to Islam, Muhammad is the greatest interpreter of the Quran, and Islam's greatest scholars of all time got this wrong. If that's the method, we can interpret anything to mean anything we want. Now, Shabir says that Muhammad had different obligations when he became a leader. I know, that's exactly my point. When he became a leader, the methods entirely changed, and that's when you get the revelations, fight those who do not believe in Allah. So if that's if that's Muhammad's job when he gets in a position of leadership, why are any other Muslims around the world wrong when they get in a position of leadership and authority to subjugate unbelievers? That's what Muhammad said he was supposed to do in that situation. Now, Shabir makes a couple of interesting claims. He says that the abrogation verses in the Quran refer to the abrogation of previous scriptures, not to certain verses of the Quran abrogating other verses of the Quran. But this interpretation, I would say, is impossible if we have any consideration for what Muhammad's companions and others said about them. He cites John Burton, 20th century British Orientalist, to defend his claim. If I'm trying to discover what an Islamic doctrine means, I prefer going with actual Islamic scholars, not 20th century British revisionists. So let's look at the passages. Chapter 16, verse 101 of the Quran, Allah says, "And when we change one communication for another communication, and Allah knows best what He reveals, they say, you are only a forger. Nay, most of them do not know." So, Muhammad's being accused of being a forger for changing something. And Shabir says, well, that's because he's changing the revelation. First of all, that would be impossible. I mean, these are the pagans of Mecca who are accusing him of being a forger. If it's for changing something in previous revelation, they didn't know enough about the Torah and the Gospel to accuse Muhammad of forgery for contradicting something in the Torah and the Gospel. But apart from that, we know the historical context here. This is Al-Wahidi. He actually gives the historical background. This verse was revealed when the idolaters said, Muhammad is mocking his companions. One day he commands them to do something, and the next day he forbids them from doing it, or brings instead something which is easier. He is nothing but a forger who says things of his own invention. So the historical background is, the polytheists are accusing Muhammad of changing his revelations. And we find the same thing with Surah 2, verse 106. When whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. The commentary, according to Muhammad's cousin, Ibn Abbas, I would assume that he has an idea of what it meant. Ibn Abbas says, then Allah mentions what was abrogated of the Quran and that which was not abrogated as a direct reference to the claim of the Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, who said to the Prophet, O Muhammad, why do you command us to do something and then forbid it? So if we look at the verses sound like they're saying something about Muhammad changing his revelations. We look at the commentaries tell us exactly. Muhammad's companions tell us what. And by the way, since Shabir wants to distinguish authentic from non-authentic traditions, you can go to Islam's most trusted sources. In Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, they're filled with passages about one verse of the Quran abrogating another verse. So wherever we go, we come down on the side of Quran verses abrogating other Quran verses. And why would we ever go against it? Because John Burton says so? Interesting. Shabir made an argument that the word silm means Islam. And let's go ahead and read the verse, chapter 2, verse 208. O you who believe, enter completely into Islam, and do not follow the footsteps of Satan. Surely he is your open enemy. Let me give some translations here. Shabir says this should read, enter completely into peace. Well, let's go through some translations. Pickthall. Come all of you into submission. Yusuf Ali, enter into Islam wholeheartedly. Hilali Khan, enter perfectly in Islam. Shakir, enter into submission, one and all. Sher Ali, come to submission, all of you. Khalifa, you shall embrace total submission. They're translating it as Islam and submission. Why would they do that? Well, we know what the historical background of this verse is. A Jew converted to Islam. His name was Abdullah ibn Salam. He converted to Islam, but he still kept Jewish dietary restrictions and the Jewish Sabbath. And this was reported to Muhammad that this Jewish convert was continuing to keep the Jewish rituals. And this verse was revealed as a response, enter completely into Islam. Notice, enter completely into peace would make no sense. The guy's not accused of being violent. He's accused of not entering completely into Islam, still maintaining Jewish practices. So the historical context shows that this actually means what it says, enter completely into Islam or into submission. But now, that's what Shabir was basing his reinterpretation of the Quran on. That this says, enter completely into peace, so the Quran must be very peaceful. Well, it doesn't mean that, and so we're left with verses of the Quran abrogating other verses. We know that's the historical context. So, verses of the Quran abrogate other verses. Well, that means the peaceful verses, which come earlier in the life of Muhammad, are abrogated or canceled by the final marching orders, which call for violently subjugating unbelievers. So, is the Quran a book of peace? I'd say no.
Yeah, so interesting interchange. So David has his views, I have mine. It's good that we can talk about it in a civil manner and look at reason, evidence, and proof. Now, the last point David made was about the translation of the second chapter of the Quran, the verse number 208, which I said means enter into peace completely. Notice what my evidence for that translation was. My evidence was an ancient grammarian who died in the year 311. I'm talking about the original Arabic. Now, David is citing a number of translations. I know this has become a common interpretation among Muslims. They think that this verse says, enter into Islam completely. It's an ancient commentary, but it's not necessarily the original text. The original text is still there before us, and it still says silm, which means, as Jad said, it means musalaha. Everywhere it's mentioned in the Quran, 6 times altogether, it always means the same thing. You put Islam in the other places, just won't work. So that's the text, and I don't think we can go by the English translations. We have to go by the original Arabic. Now, David is saying that there are so many passages in Bukhari and Muslim, these are hadiths, which say that some verse of the Quran has abrogated some others. But anyone who does a careful study of this, not only John Burton, but even a scholar like Muhammad Khalil, writing an article in Contemporary Approaches to Islam, it's a modern book. But nevertheless, people like myself, we go back through and we see, why did Muslims think at one time that one verse of the Quran abrogates another one? Did they have something that reliably is traced back to the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, that he says that some verse cancels some other one or abrogated another one? And when we trace these reports carefully, we realize that this is an idea that emerged among early Muslims, that some verses cancel some others, but it's not a reality. The Quran, as Taha Shabir Ally has pointed out, is revealed in an absolute sense. This is the Word of God. Now, you cannot let some other report by somebody else lead you to believe that one of the verses is now canceled. It's like you have the book, you're saying, okay, this is the Word of God. I read this, oh, this is what God is saying to me. And somebody says to you, oh, you know that? That one is canceled. So, like, what authority does he have to tell you that somebody has canceled the Word of God? So we have to get that on authority that is equal to the authority of the Quran itself, which Muslims have confidence has been reliably transmitted by memory and also by in writing. So with that confidence in the Quran, a Muslim would not be on good ground to accept some report that says that the verse of the Quran is no longer applicable and we must follow something else. So when John Burton proves that in a very systematic and academic fashion, a person like me gravitates to his work because we see that this man knows what we are also discovering for ourselves. And in fact, John Burton is not just some individual. He has actually emerged as the known expert in academic circles on the question of whether or not verses of the Quran abrogate each other. So, in short, those like ISIS and others who want to say, okay, we are going to go and fight the enemy, and they're practicing what David described as the stage 3. We must be out to dominate non-Muslims. Now, David seems to like that interpretation, not because he's a Muslim. He's saying, oh, he has more respect for Muhammad than some Muslims, maybe like myself, do, because I'm looking at the statement, the hadith. I'm going to go with that. I'm going with the Quran. David is saying that he has more respect for that saying of Muhammad than I have, because he wants to follow. But my suspicion is that David actually is not really more respectful of the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, he is more happy with the fact that there are people like the ISIS group out there who are making Islam look very bad. Because David is out to minister to and evangelize Muslims, and to him it is of great advantage to have people like ISIS. We reel when somebody dies from a terrorist bombing or killing, and there are some people who are celebrating, not necessarily David, perhaps not David. Some people may be celebrating and thinking, yeah, now we'll be able to prove to the world that this Islam is really something terrible. Leave Islam, come to Christianity, the Bible, and the Christ. But when we look at the matter systematically, even chapter 16, verse number 101, he's citing Al-Wahidi. Do you know when Al-Wahidi was writing? He was writing in the 4th century. So that means more than 300 years after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. How does he know that what this verse is referring to as an authority? Yes, we might refer to these scholars, use their studies, but we have to come to our own systematic conclusion after a careful study. And after a careful study, it is clear that even this chapter 16 passage, of the Quran is referring to the Quran abrogating previous revelations. Even chapter 16 gives some food laws, and the Jews are naturally complaining. How do we have some food laws, and we were practicing kosher laws for such a long time, and now God sends a new prophet with a new regulation? How could it be a new regulation? This prophet he cannot be a true prophet. So God is saying in response, if we cancel one regulation, we've given you one regulation, that's fine, but if we cancel that now and replace it with another revelation, then we have the full authority to do that as God. And we have the wisdom to know what to give at a certain time. We're giving a new dispensation. In fact, Christians accept that the New Testament abrogates the Old. There is an old dispensation, there's a new dispensation. Muslims are saying there's a newer dispensation. The Jews said we cannot accept the Christian New Testament, the new dispensation. They rejected Jesus because to them Jesus was coming with something new and rejecting their laws. And the same objection they are now launching to the Prophet Muhammad. But if Christians accept that Jesus can come with something new, as a new prophet bringing new revelation, Muslims accept that too. And Muslims say that after Jesus, another prophet came with a final revelation, giving new dispensations and new regulations to people. And so that's what that passage is referring to. It does not prove that some verses of the Quran abrogate some others, so that some verses give you peace for the stage 1 and some others to tell you about domination for stage 3. No, all of these verses follow a unified principle that there is justice to be enforced in society. And there is a system of justice to be in place. And that system of justice that is now being introduced and made possible to unify the people will be belief in one God. This is where the verses mention non-belief, because now it turns out to be a struggle between believers and non-believers. So when the Quran is speaking about fighting the disbelievers, it does not mean that you fight all disbelievers. It means that in that particular context, as Sherman Jackson has written about in his article, Jihad in the Modern World, in that context, it was a struggle between two groups. One group was known as the believers, the other group is known as the non-believers. It does not mean that there should be a continuing struggle between believers and non-believers. There's a struggle between those two groups, and this is how the groups are called. But there's nothing in the Quran that would mean that Muslims have to dominate non-believers. In fact, another academic scholar, Fred Donner, wrote a recent book in which he said that it looks like the movement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the movement of believers, including Jews and Christians. Not everybody accepts his thesis, and I also have difficulty with that thesis. But his thesis, the fact that an academic scholar can arrive there, shows that there are passages in the Quran which actually are very favorable towards Jews and Christians in particular, and many other believers in God as well. So it wasn't a struggle between Islam and non-Islam, that Islam has to dominate the others. That Islam was actually struggling for its own existence to stay alive. Non-Muslims were hovering over, and with allied forces threatening to decimate the entire population. The Muslims had to be defensive and preserve themselves, and they saw the struggle as between believers and non-believers. But it's not essentially a struggle between believers and non-believers. It's the struggle to stay alive. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Shabir says that the commands to fight unbelievers, I'll start at the end there. Shabir says that the commands to fight unbelievers was because there were two groups, believers and unbelievers, but it's not saying to fight unbelievers just because they're unbelievers. Now, I gave the historical context of 929. The Quraysh were wondering how they're going to make money, and then Muhammad receives a command to fight the Jews and the Christians until they pay the jizya as a way of making money. So how exactly does that historical context or the literary context, keep in mind we read the entire passage, there was not one word about self-defense in that entire passage. So if that's what Allah really means, couldn't he say one word about this having something to do with self-defense instead of complaining that Christians say that Jesus is the Son of God and that we try to extinguish the light of Allah with our mouths? Couldn't he have put one word in that passage when he calls on Muslims to fight us? I mean, let me give an example here. Suppose there's a politician. That politician, after some terrorist attack, comes out and says, we must fight those who believe in Allah. And suppose there's a lot of negative publicity, and then he comes back and says, well, I was only talking about terrorists. Would you say, hey, you need to be a little more clear when you're talking about fighting people? If you're talking about killing people, you need to be very clear about whom you're talking about here? Would we accept if a president of the United States stepped up and said, we must fight those who believe in Allah? And then when he's challenged on, he says, no, I'm just talking about particular people who believe in Allah and were attacking us. That's all I meant. We would never accept that. We would never accept that communication. Why do you say that you're applying that reasoning to Allah, who claims to be perfectly clear in his commands? Allah says he means exactly what he says. Well, aren't there words for fight in self-defense? Aren't there words for fight people who are attacking you? Why does he say fight those who do not believe? Everything Shabir is saying about what Allah really means, Allah could have said that. Allah could have said it just as clearly as Shabir did, but he didn't. He repeatedly emphasizes fighting unbelievers. And when he says, those who are with Muhammad are severe against disbelievers and merciful among themselves, how could the categories be any more clear here? They couldn't. Now, Shabir says that Muslim writers invented stories to justify their own violence. I have to point out, all those sources contain peaceful passages as well. So if they're just trying to justify violence, then why didn't they wipe out the peaceful passages? The only conclusion to draw is that they're trying to do Islamic history as well as they can, and that they preserve both. But those peaceful and violent teachings of Islam all fall into the same categories as the peaceful and violent teachings of the Quran. Shabir again says that silm means peace everywhere it's used in the Quran. As far as that form of silm right there is used once in the Quran in that verse. We have the historical background. We know the historical. This isn't how are we going to interpret this? We know the historical background. The translation, enter completely into peace, makes no sense as a response to, here's a guy who continues to keep the Jewish Sabbath. Makes no sense. There's only one interpretation that makes sense, and that's why every respected Muslim commentator that I could find translates it as Islam. And, of course, Shabir seeks the one who fits that view. But this just doesn't overwhelm the historical context and the vast array of Islamic commentators who give the correct meaning. Now, why do Muslims think that certain Quran verses abrogate others? He complains about me quoting Al-Wahidi. I quoted Al-Wahidi just for some diversity, because I tend to quote Ibn Abbas and Ibn Kathir, both of whom say that verses of the Quran abrogate other verses of the Quran. But there's another problem here. Let's look at one of the verses we quoted. Chapter 2, verse 106. Whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. Notice that part. Whatever verses we abrogate or cause to be forgotten. So, some things are being caused to be forgotten. Allah will reveal something and then he causes it to be forgotten. Shabir says, well, this is talking about prior revelations. Well, in chapter 87, verses 6 to 7, Allah says specifically to Muhammad, he's talking to Muhammad here. He's not talking about anyone, he's talking to Muhammad. He says, we will make you recite the message, so you shall not forget, except as Allah wills. So this is Allah talking to Muhammad. Muhammad, we're making you recite the message, so you shall not forget, except as Allah wills. So Muhammad himself is forgetting things that are revealed to him from Allah when Allah wants him to forget those things. So is this applying to previous revelations? No, it's applying to the revelations to Muhammad. That's according to the Quran. I'm not quoting a commentator there. That's Allah saying that Muhammad forgets revelations because Allah wants him to. Now, I said I have more respect for Muhammad. Shabir says, I said I have more respect for Muhammad's sayings than Western Muslims. No, I have more respect for the clarity of Quran verses and quotations from Muhammad, namely that Allah says he means what he says, and that's what we would find with Muhammad as well. And if you wanted to reinterpret them, you have to accuse them of being horrible communicators. He says that I actually like ISIS killing people because I can use that to win converts. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. I love it when ISIS goes around raping their captives and chopping people's heads off and crucifying them and blowing their brains out, because I think it'll really help me in my ministry work. Now, as far as later Muslims corrupting history, I just have to point this out. Here again, I have more respect for the integrity of the early Muslim community than Shabir does. When he's rejecting these passages and saying, oh, people made them up, keep in mind, these guys are tracing their claims back to very early Muslim authorities here. When we talk about abrogation, these are passages that go back to Umar and Uthman, the second and third rightly guided caliph, and some of Muhammad's closest companions. Well, they're lying. They're lying when they say that this abrogated that. Someone in the earliest Muslim community must be lying, right? if Shabir is serious about this, I have to say he's not very far away from the same argument that is used by people who say Muhammad never existed. People like Robert Spencer, who claim Muhammad may have never even existed. He basically says that certain Arabs at a certain time realized that they need some uniting figure, and so they invented a bunch of stories, and they invented this figure of Muhammad, who may have been an actual figure, but at least they invented much of his history in order to rally them, and then so that they could go out and fight and win and conquer. So that's the claim. And what's Shabir saying? Well, all these passages about fighting and subjugating and so on, yes, they're there, but this was later Muslim leaders inventing these passages to justify their own actions. Well, if they can invent the history of Muhammad that way, why couldn't they invent a little more so that we can't know anything about Muhammad? Let me put it this way. If the earliest generations of Muslims were this big, massive group of deceivers writing things to justify what they're doing, how can we know anything about Islam? By the Quran? The Quran only mentions Muhammad by name 4 times. 3 of those could be a title and not even a name. So we have to go outside the Quran for sources. But if this is nothing but a bunch of liars, my Muslim friends, don't tell me that you know a whole lot about Islam if you're accepting this method.
Yeah. Okay, so for my final concluding statement, folks, you notice that I hesitated earlier to attribute to David the feeling that it's good that people are dying because that way he gets to spread his evangelizing message. But I was shocked that he came forward and he shamelessly confessed to having that attitude. David says that he is talking about the historical context. But then, to prove that historical context, what does he cite Ibn Kathir? Ibn Kathir died in the year 774. He was writing more than 700 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. How does he know the historical context? Okay, he has reports that go back to some early Muslims. And David is citing early Muslim caliph Omar, for example. Did Omar write anything that you have in your hands today? No. What you have is that somebody in about the 3rd century of Islam writes a book and says that I heard from such and such a person, who heard from such and such, who heard from such and such, who heard from such and such, who heard from Omar that he said this. And then that is written down. That's called a tradition or a hadith in Arabic. It's related by word of mouth from one person to another. And you know how Chinese whispers works. If you relate something and you pass it on, it becomes something else at the end. To be sure, some early Muslim scholars tried to be stringent in their methods to weed out the wheat from the chaff and to pass on good material, but we still have a mixture in our sources between good and bad. We have to sift through them. So what do the non-Muslim historians do? They want to find out who was Muhammad in history. Forget about whether we believe in him to be a man of God or a prophet of God or whatever. We just want to know historically what was that man. And now David is saying, well, if I follow Shabir's method, I would go with Robert Spencer. And now he shouldn't be associating himself with Robert Spencer because Robert Spencer is known for his own way of trying to disprove Islam. That seems to be everything that he's all about. But we should associate ourselves with academic scholars. Why not pick somebody like William Montgomery Watt, who I mentioned previously, who takes a middle position and says, yes, there are things that we cannot trust in the narratives that Muslims compiled many hundreds of years after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but there are some broad outlines that we can trace. And when we trace those broad outlines, as I have done today, and David has agreed with me on at least this aspect, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not fight against the enemy until he had that responsibility to protect. Now, was this his plan from the beginning? To prove that this was the plan in Muhammad's mind, he cited something from a historical book, Tabari. And he was saying, I don't remember if I cited anyone other than Ibn Kathir. Yes, you cited Tabari. And Tabari was writing in the 3rd century or 4th century of Islam. He died in the year 311. 310. So we are dealing with things compiled hundreds of years later on. That cannot necessarily be taken to be so authentic. So why didn't, he's asking, if later Muslims invented the idea of a warring religion and credited that back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, why didn't they wipe out the peaceful passages? And then he answered his own question by saying, well, there were historians who just compiled everything, even the ones which were against them. And that's what I'm saying. I'm glad he agreed with that. They were compiling that which was before them, but they were also inserting new stuff. And who is the one who said before me that they inserted the new stuff? I cited Lloyd Ridgeon. He's not necessarily a Muslim. I don't know what he is, but his name does not immediately sound like he's a Muslim. All I know is that he's an academic scholar who's writing about religions in general. He's written about Islam in particular. His article is there in the book War and Peace in the World's Religions. So this is what non-Muslims who want to be fair and who do not have an agenda of evangelizing Muslims, this is what they're saying. This is one view on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that he was made into a warrior figure later on. And in fact, I will say to you that this is what the biblical writers did with Yahweh. They said that Yahweh is a man of war. They made him into a warrior. They made Joshua and others into warriors. Some of the stories, some of the horrific genocidal incidents that are mentioned in the book of Joshua, historians today think that these are not authentic stories. These were made up by Israelites later on when they rewrote their history. But they made Joshua into a warlike figure. And the Quran, to me, presents Joshua as a simple, humble individual, a companion of Moses. And not only Joshua, but Jesus and Abraham and Moses and David and Saul. And those figures who cannot be rehabilitated like this were just simply not mentioned in the Quran. Like, for example, Samson, who we know to be the world's first suicide killer because he killed himself and everybody in the arena with him. So the Quran does present a peaceful prophet with a peaceful message. It is a book of peace. Thank you very much.
Well, Shabir said I shouldn't be citing Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer's a friend of mine. I love Robert Spencer. But I happen to disagree with Robert Spencer on this issue. I actually debated Robert Spencer on whether Muhammad existed. You can watch that online. But I think Shabir didn't understand the point of bringing that up. My point is that as far as the basic argument goes, Shabir's on the same side with Robert Spencer when it comes to that. By attacking the Muslim sources and pointing out that all of these Muslim sources contain fabrications, and that means that we can't trust the Muslim sources. That means we can't trust the people that these sources are being traced back to. It means we don't know anything, right? We don't have a source that we can put our hands on and say, this is a reliable source of information about Muhammad. Well, if we have no reliable source of information about Muhammad, that's not very far from what Robert Spencer and others say. That if people later can just invent massive numbers of traditions and stories about Muhammad, and they can get away with it, that can make them, and those get passed down to us. If someone can do that, why couldn't they go a little further and just invent Muhammad wholesale? Now again, I'm not the one saying that. I'm pointing that Shabir is leaning in the direction and that he's only one step away from that. He says, just to sum up here, I guess, is the Quran a book of peace? Well, if you're reading it the way Allah says, he claims to be perfectly clear. He lays down passages on abrogation. I even showed that the Quran showed that he's specifically talking to Muhammad in one of those passages. Well, if that's the case, then you look and you see peaceful verses. You see some verses that call for fighting in self-defense. And you see other verses that specifically say, fight those who do not believe, fight those of the unbelievers who are near to you. If Allah means exactly what he says, then we have to figure out, when do certain verses apply? When do others apply? Well, we know the historical background here. We know when the peaceful revelations were revealed. We know when the violent revelations were revealed. The final marching orders are for fighting unbelievers. Now, I pointed out that there are peaceful and violent traditions in the Muslim sources, and Shabir said, well, somehow this shows that they were inserting the violent sources. No, I think he missed the point there as well. The point is, if later Muslim scholars and authorities are inventing stories in order to justify violent expansion, why do they include peaceful passages? Why do they include peaceful stories? They could, if they felt free to just invent Islam as they went along, they could have thrown all those out and just made Islam violent. So the presence of both peaceful and violent passages shows that they're not just coming down for one agenda or the other, but they're actually they're doing their best to preserve authentic material about Muhammad. If that's the case, you're stuck with the peaceful passages and the violent passages. The problem is when we place these into a historical framework, you get the peaceful verses coming early on. You get the violent verses coming as soon as Muhammad is able to violently subjugate unbelievers. Now, Shabir has shown, I think, that the Quran can be a book of peace if you're willing to take certain steps. So if you're willing to declare that Allah isn't as clear as he claims to be, if you're willing to declare that the historical context is just unreliable and we can't trust these sources, and we can't really know much about Muhammad because the early generations of Muslims were just a bunch of liars who felt like they could make anything up, even though Muhammad said that the best generations of Muslims are those first 3 generations. And according to Shabir, those must have been the biggest bunch of liars the world has ever seen, given the amount of material they produced about Muhammad. So if you're willing to say, well, Muhammad says these are the best generations, but they're actually a bunch of liars. If you're willing to accuse this community of being deceivers, if you're willing to declare that Islam's greatest commentators all got it wrong, well, then you can conclude that Islam is a religion of peace and that the Quran is a book of peace. And there are many Muslims who are willing to take those steps. But is that Islam? Allah says what? You must find this is in the Quran. He says you must find no resistance against Muhammad's decisions. Where are Muhammad's decisions? The Quran is not Muhammad's decisions. According to Islam, that's the eternal word of Allah. Where do you find Muhammad's decisions to submit to them? The Quran says that Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslims. Chapter 33, verse 21. Where do you find that pattern of conduct? From all of these works that I'm quoting that Shabir says just aren't reliable. And so you can't even obey the Quran without going to these passages. But when you go to these passages, you find the same things you find in the Quran. Fight those who do not believe. So I would say Islam and jihad, the Quran and jihad stand or fall together. If you reject the jihad passages, you have to reject the rest.
Please join with me in thanking our speakers for tonight's debate.